I want to quickly introduce myself for anyone who doesn't know me yet. My name is Katharina. I go by Space Cookie with a K wherever there is user profiles. I've been involved in the Rust community since 2017 in a few ways. I'm currently a freelancer, so hire me. Also, currently, I mostly write free software, which is pretty cool. I have been known to shave a yak or two and inspire other people to shave yaks. And an acquaintance a few years ago described me as annoyingly anarchist, so I thought that definitely deserves to be on the slide because, I don't know, that sounds kind of cool. If you have any questions or comments, and you're at this conference, please come talk to me. Otherwise, I really like emails. Like if you can DM me on Twitter, but sometimes I will not check my DMs in like months because it's Twitter. So if you want to reply from me, email or XMPP is actually the simplest way of doing it. Also, this talk comes with a mild content warning about police brutality. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to mention some political activism stuff. And so just be warned, there's like subject matter here that is sensitive. So, this talk sort of has three parts. The first one is an exploration of problem space. The second one is an introduction of a solution to this problem space. And the third one is the outlook into the future and something that I am actually working on directly as well. And so I want to start talking to you all about all of this, starting with Fukushima in 2011. So in 2011, there was an underwater earthquake, a seaquake, near the coast of Japan, off the west coast. It was a quite really strong earthquake, and it caused a tsunami to hit the west coast of Japan and destroy large parts of the coastal regions. As part of this, so this is the earthquake magnitude map, but funnily enough, like the red regions on that map correspond pretty much to the destruction caused by the tsunami. Anything further inland, just because Japan is very earthquake prepared, was actually not that badly damaged. It was mostly the tidal wave that caused damage, not the earthquake. On the west coast of Japan were several nuclear power stations, and one of them, in particular, I forgot its name, but like the power station in the Fukushima region directly, was hit quite badly. It suffered a lot of damage to its actual structure. Its emergency power generators were destroyed. And if you don't know this, a nuclear power station, the fuel rods that are used in the reactor are only used for a couple of years before they're not strong enough to heat the water in the reactor anymore, but they're still radioactive. So what they do is they keep these rods in these water basins to let them cool off, and they do this for decades. They have to stay there for a very, very long time. They're not strong enough anymore to be used in a reactor, but they're still radioactive, and so they're kept underwater so that the radiation is blocked. But also, because the radiation warms up the water, the pool slowly evaporates, and so you need to cool the water in these pools because otherwise the radiation is going to get out and kill everyone. So a tidal wave destroying the backup generators for a power station that then goes offline kind of meant that they couldn't cool that water anymore, and radiation started leaking out. It was I think it was like a week of disaster care. A lot of people put their lives into this and suffered radiation poisoning, trying to contain this, and they filled it with seawater, and they kind of got it under control again. So that's not the actual point here. Tidal waves, they happen and they cause destruction. Something that I found really interesting at the time was that I later, a few years later, got into contact with people who were actually near the Fukushima region at the time, and they said, yeah, look, you living on the other side of the planet had a much more complete picture of what was going on than I, who was really close to what was going on. And that was because the tidal wave hadn't just damaged the power station. That's something that people talk about. What it had also done is basically taken out the entire 3G network, and people couldn't really communicate with each other anymore. the first responders going and evacuating people had to go from door to door and house to house to get people out the region, because there was no way of getting any sort of emergency broadcast out because the infrastructure had been destroyed. And so it actually skews the perspective a little bit. People who are not actually involved knowing a lot more about something that is going on than the people who are involved. So it also shows that infrastructure is really vulnerable. There is a slightly more recent example, and slightly more local, from last year. The California wildfires caused a similar problem where either 3G and LTE network towers, like the cell towers, were just destroyed, or they just lost their power hookup. And a cell tower without any power is kind of useless. It meant that, again, evacuating towns in affected regions, people needed to use like loud sirens, PSA systems, driving from town to town, getting people out, because any kind of emergency broadcast wasn't getting through. And yeah, that's just something that, I think that's something that a lot of people forget when disasters sort of strike, that the infrastructure that we all rely on to communicate with each other is just as vulnerable as the people's homes and the people who are involved, and it makes situations worse. So that's sort of one side. There's, natural disasters. Another sort of area where the infrastructure that we have and the way that we build it becomes problematic is when you consider political persecution. So what if not a natural disaster destroys your infrastructure, but the government or some sort of organization decides, the way that people communicate isn't really what they want? This sort of takes two forms. I'm going to talk about the second one first and then about the first one, because I'm very smart in making these slides. So the first one is preventing people from speaking out, and the first one, or the second one I guess, is punishing people for speaking out. So I think this is an event that a lot of people are aware of. In 2011 as well, it was an interesting year, there were a few revolutions in the Middle East. It was titled the Arabic Spring, and millions of people took to the streets to take control over their countries in a way that they had previously not. And I don't think these uprisings were in themselves super special, but the thing that made them special is that they were kind of televised. So when people spoke of the Egyptian revolution and the uprisings, they talked about a Twitter revolution, because that's what they saw, and people who lived thousands of miles away were able to observe what was going on in a country they had maybe never been in. Egypt by itself wasn't the only country. I have a list of a few of these uprisings in a later slide. But what happened was that at some point in January of 2011, just a few days after the riots started, the Egyptian government shut down the internet, and they shut down the cell phone network, and people that were relying on the cell phone network to communicate with each other no longer could. This, of course, it has an impact on how people organize. It didn't really slow down what happened in Egypt, but it did mean that people had to communicate with each other differently. And in fact, so I said there is a list of uprisings, but funnily enough, this list is also the list of internet shutdowns from 2007. This is a short list, by the way. If you do some digging into this, there's hundreds, and I could not possibly fit them all onto this slide. This is a small selection of events where the government or a regime shut down the internet, either with DNS filtering or just shutting down the actual infrastructure, like the cell phone network and stuff, for reasons of political uprisings and public safety. In some cases it's difficult to sort of find out, because they're not going to say, oh, we shut down the internet because people are rioting. They're going to make up some story, and you sort of have to put pieces together from different stories where you see, well, this happened, and then this happened, and then you sort of get a more complete picture. These shutdowns, by the way, are on the rise. In 2018 alone, there have been like 196 internet shutdowns in, I think, 25 different countries. So, like, 2018 has been extreme. I actually don't know the numbers so far for 2019, but if you consider, if you look at like 2016, 17, 18, it's been going upward, like it's been trending up. There's a very long report by the Access Now Foundation called the Keep It On report that goes into, this is a small excerpt from that, how many shutdowns there were, for what reasons, in what capacity, like technologically, how they were enforced, etc., etc. It's really interesting if you're interested in this sort of stuff. I can only recommend reading through that. It's kind of eye-opening. And it really, again, shows how vulnerable the cell phone network is. I want to come to a slightly more recent example again, and that is Hong Kong in 2019. This summer, a lot of people took to the streets in Hong Kong in a way that I think a lot of people had never seen before. And I think what was kind of special about Hong Kong, again, was because it was streamed. I could wake up in the morning and my Twitter timeline would be full of videos of like what had happened in Hong Kong. And I think that made people, a lot of people feel a lot closer to what was going on than if it had been more isolated. So a small history primer in case you're not familiar with British colonialist history. Hong Kong was a British colony that was given to Britain as sort of the end of the Second Opium War, and it was on a 99-year lease. And I guess the people who signed this lease never thought that 99 years could come to an end, but in 1997 it came to an end, and the Chinese government did, want their territory back. And after, I think there was like 10 years of negotiation in total how this would happen. The logistics alone are actually kind of interesting. They had to change several thousand street signs and hundreds of thousands of like public servants' uniforms to not have the British flag on it anymore and stuff like that. Really quite interesting. But what was mostly negotiated and agreed on was a 50-year transition period between Hong Kong being returned to China and Hong Kong becoming part of the main administrative body of mainland China. So what is currently the situation is that Hong Kong is relatively independent. It's a sort of one country, two system rule where they have their own government, their own rules, laws, and courts. And that's very important. And also, interestingly enough, they do not have an extradition treaty with mainland China. So there's a lot of political refugees from mainland China, activists who go to Hong Kong to seek refuge because Hong Kong does not extradite people to the mainland. So, in summer of 2019, I think it was like May or June or something like that, the Hong Kong government proposed a new extradition treaty with China that would allow the Chinese government to have easy access with like a very short court ruling from a Hong Kong court to refugees or wanted criminals in China that were taking refuge in Hong Kong. This prompted a lot of people to go protest, and you can find pictures of this. Literally millions of people went to the streets in peaceful protests, arguing, no, we don't want this. This is really like, you're acting against the will of the people. The government sort of didn't care, and then people started going to streets in slightly different ways. They still protested, but without permits, and I think it's about estimated that about 500,000 people still took part in the more violent protests, not the peaceful ones. They pretty quickly clashed with riot police that sometimes also just went after the press. I've seen videos where it was like a bunch of press people were taking pictures of something and then the police fired tear gas on them. What's really interesting about the way that they organized themselves was that there was like this huge Telegram channel with literally tens and hundreds of thousands of people in it. A Telegram channel is a sort of thing where just a small number of people can like post stuff and everyone else is like a subscription list. And so the main organizers and the people who like rallied people around them could announce information about what was going on, where people should go, what was, what the cops were doing, and lots of people could immediately get access to that information. And then, people organize themselves in smaller groups like you usually do at these sort of events. This sort of, the highlight of this was when a bunch of protesters stormed a Hong Kong government building, which I think was like a courthouse or like a court building, and they demanded the resignation of several of several politicians in the Hong Kong government that were responsible or had been responsible for this extradition bill. They sort of tried to appease the protesters by shelving the bill, but they wouldn't have it. Something happened then in sort of mid-June, and I think this was shortly after they stormed the government building, but I could be wrong, it could have been slightly before, which was that coincidentally Telegram was suddenly offline for like a few hours during one of the engagements. What had happened is that they were suffering a really large-scale DDoS, denial of service attack, and millions of people on the street lost the way of communicating with each other and finding out new information about what was going on. Later, Telegram claimed that it was Chinese state actors that DDoSed them, and while I find that believable, I'm not sure, like for this talk, I'm not sure that matters, because the point still was someone had the resources to take down this central node of communication. And the most important thing is the Hong Kong government didn't actually do this. They didn't shut down their LTE network. It was a centralized service. And that sort of feeds into another thing. We're not just talking about centralized infrastructure, we're also talking about centralized services. So Telegram, Signal, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of these applications that people use to communicate, they're all centralized in one company or even just one project's hands. They're not decentralized in a way where it makes it impossible to shut them down. And so I'm pretty sure if I throw enough money at someone, I could DDoS Signal. And then everyone who uses Signal is dependent on using that service can't communicate anymore during the time of the attack. So I want to add a bit of a disclaimer here, especially when people in the West, and like America and Europe mostly, talk about the internet, it is sometimes upheld like this beacon of freedom of speech and this amazing thing. And I would just like to sort of say, when I talk about internet shutdowns, the internet is kind of highly commercialized and it's kind of run by just a few companies. It's really interesting to see when you ask people, how many services, what services by how many companies do you use? And very rarely is it above like 5. Some people get like all of the things that they do on the internet. It's like 2 or 3 companies, and so we put a lot of control of our lives into the hands of very few people. And it means that when I talk about internet shutdowns here, I don't want this to be an endorsement of the internet. It's sort of a way to communicate that people are being prevented from communicating, not actually because the internet is perfect or that we shouldn't change something about the way that it works. All of this is to say that there aren't alternatives. I could probably talk about just this slide for literally hours, and I won't. There's a few reasons why alternatives haven't taken really off. I think some of it is because solutions are being poorly communicated. Sometimes it's just really difficult to get something started. I think also the way that we all sort of grow up with expecting services to be centralized means that whenever we then encounter something that is decentralized, it sort of goes against the way that we're thinking. I know that when I started working on distributed systems, I had to unlearn a bunch of stuff that I had thought of as dogmatic, because that's the way I was taught or the way that I understood technology. And suddenly, if you remove servers and if you remove central access points, you have to change your entire outlook onto things, and so it becomes a lot more difficult to communicate to someone who isn't tech engaged. I also think that everything that I've been talking about so far sort of feeds into 3 different points. Is that we surrender control of infrastructure and services or our personal communication in a lot of ways, whether that be our data that we give to companies, or the devices that we're not allowed to control or repair, or the infrastructure that we use. And I think this all ties into the same point. I mentioned another type of political persecution, and that is state surveillance. So state surveillance in this case means, you go to a protest, you have your phone with you, and then after the protest, the government knows who you are because you were at the protest. They can link your phone to the protest and your phone to you. This is something that happened in Ukraine, for example, or this is something where you can find news articles about where it happened in Ukraine, because someone wrote about it, where people who were involved in like a protest then got like a, by the way, you were like involved in illegal activities. There is another event, it happened also in Germany in 2011, where a bunch of people going to a like a Nazi party was marching in the streets, and hundreds of thousands of people were pouring out and like countering them. And they actually came from like multiple cities just to like, block the Nazis. And then the police deployed these devices that like basically just swept up everyone's phone IDs and had then a list of everyone who was involved in the protest. They got sued over that. I actually don't know what happened as a result. The reason for this is that phone tracking is pretty damn easy. There's the International Mobile Equipment Identifier, or IEMEI, that every mobile device has one of these. When I registered an AT&T SIM card a few days ago, I had to give them my IMEI to go into like the record of, this is my name, this is my number, this is my IMEI. And so if I go to some sort of protest and they can just, they can identify this ID on a certain cell tower, then they have my name. And I think this happens a lot more frequently than people realize, just because I think the tech to do this is incredibly cheap, and I don't understand why the police wouldn't do it. If you do some digging, you can actually find more instances of this happening, but it's not something that is like widely discussed, I feel. So, a lot of these problems boil down to this. We build our communication infrastructure, we build everything in these star shapes. So we have central antennas that hook into devices, and we have centralized services that everyone communicates via. And I think any kind of movement for change has to start also there. Maybe not exclusively, of course, but this is where our fight has to start. And so this has been the exploration of problem domain. I could be talking about events that were problematic, or where centralized infrastructure became dangerous to people for a lot longer, but I want to kind of talk about something else here, and that is solutions. So there's a project mostly in Germany, but it's been starting to spread to other countries as well in Europe, and I'm kind of hoping that it'll take off here, called Freifunk. In German it means free radio. What it is a free software project which develops firmware, routers, and antennas. And the way that it's organized is also kind of interesting, because there's no project leadership, there's no teams. Basically, any sort of local community that wants to make a chapter just makes a chapter. And they are either organized into like per city, or if a city isn't large enough, a few villages sometimes band together and are like, oh, we're this county, and so this is our community now. The idea is that everyone has a Wi-Fi router at home. And what happened if we linked all of these Wi-Fi routers together into a huge mesh network? Your neighbor might not have one, but 2 houses down, someone might have a Wi-Fi network, and the range is just going to be large enough that they can interact with each other. And so you end up with these networks across the city where lots of routers can communicate with each other and pass messages through. As part of this, the project developed some routing algorithms for these decentralized networks. These are like 20 years old at this point. This is not new stuff. The 2 mostly used ones are OLSR, which stands for Optimized Link State Routing, and Batman, which stands for someone wanted to spell Batman. What's really interesting though is that those two are being used not because they were first, but because they're kind of proven. There's these battle mesh competitions every May in Berlin, where people from all over the world come to Berlin with their newly developed routing algorithms and like fight each other in like competitions, where it's like, okay, so I want to transfer this 1 terabyte of data from here through this network over here, and then whoever does the best job gets like a prize and a trophy and I don't know, like a steak or something. But it also means that the community that built itself around this is open to innovate, and also if something better comes along, these are going to be dumped and like something else is going to take off. So it's a very sort of bottom-up organized community. The cool thing about the routers is that basically anything by TP-Link is supported. I don't know why exactly, but I think TP-Link just has really good documentation for their hardware. But you also, if you're not a tech-involved person, you can just buy a pre-installed one. They're like 10 euros more if you want a volunteer to basically flash a firmware for you, and they come with a little sticker, and then you just basically plug in and that works. So this is sort of the goal. Everyone, lots of people, enough people, have these Wi-Fi routers at home, and they sort of link together. The interesting thing here is that if you, for example, have metered internet, or you have a really bad uplink, or I don't know, any reason, and you don't want to share your internet uplink with others, you don't have to. You can just be a repeater on the network, and that's totally valid. And then there's other people, and usually these are like either non-profits that run these things. For example, my hackerspace has one of these exits, where then people connect to this open Wi-Fi that's just literally everywhere, and it's being routed through these hops through the city, and then at some point goes and can just enter the normal internet. It also uses a VPN all the way through, so technically the exit node could spy on you, but you don't have to like trust all of the nodes in between. So that's all nice and good. Wi-Fi routers are cool, and they have maybe a few hundred meters of range. But what about long range? I said I would hope that this could be a thing in the US, and the US is pretty big. So what about long range? Well, there's a few approaches to long range antennas. These I think are like off-the-shelf antennas that you can just buy. Also, these frequencies are for Europe. I have no idea what the FCC allows. Maybe you should look that up. But 2.4 and 5 gigahertz are obviously the Wi-Fi ranges. They, at least in Europe, have massive limitations of how much power you're allowed to dump into them. So they're only really good for medium range, so like a couple of miles. The 60 gigahertz range in Europe, or Central Europe at least, is where it's really at, because there's very few power limitations. So basically as big an antenna you can build. There are also schematics online for building your own antennas, and as I said, this is a community. People, experiment around with stuff, and if you don't have a lot of money for something to buy, you can usually get maybe like $50 worth of scrap metal and a weekend of your time and build a Wi-Fi antenna yourself. So a few of these long-range links are like, for example, recently there was the Chaos Communication Camp that was basically in the middle of nowhere, well, 35 miles away from the next city. And what we did is we had a point-to-point antenna to the Berlin TV tower, and that was our internet hookup, or a backup internet hookup. We also had a fiber, but we didn't want to risk like a rodent eating, like nibbling on that. Everyone no longer has internet. It was an 8 millisecond link delay, and you got about 380 megabits through it. And like these long-range links, at least in Europe, are not uncommon. The longest one that I've seen documented was like 250 kilometers or 156 miles. And if you look at like a map of networks, this is around Munich. The blue dots are just zones where you have this free Wi-Fi, and the green ones are the links. And so the link that you can see in the bottom right there is the 150-mile one that goes from South Germany into a mountain village in Switzerland. It's pretty cool. You don't have to spend a lot of money, as I said, to build antennas. Sometimes a tin can and like $20 worth of a Wi-Fi like USB dongle is enough. Also Pringles cans, really good, also delicious. You eat them and then you build the antenna. As I said, there is a wiki, several wikis actually. Most of the information, unfortunately, is in German. But if you look just for the schematics, they're schematics. You don't really have to speak the language of the little notes on the sides. They're just building instructions. And also, you can go through this and find out the name of the antenna. There's also English resources available somewhere. It's just not super readily available. So, I've been talking for about half an hour now, and I want to give you a short summary. In summary, every top-down controlled infrastructure can be turned against you, whether that is by the Earth or by your government. And I think people forget that, and I forget that sometimes, how dependent we are on this stuff. The second thing is that infrastructure requires constant work. If you neglect your infrastructure, then it's not going to work. If if something happens to it and you don't fix it, it's not going to work. But also, these Freifunk networks, they don't maintain themselves. Literally thousands of volunteers take care of them. But because it's so many people, no single person has to do that much work because everyone sort of just collaborates a little bit. And honestly, I think that is kind of amazing. And I think that's something we should strive for more. I feel, with the ubiquity of technology in our lives, I would say that it is our responsibility to take care of or maintain and have ownership of the infrastructure and the technology that connects us all, because it should belong to all of us. So far so good, and I would love to chat with some of you about Freifunk, and there's some cool stuff there. But there is this other question: what if you can't have infrastructure? What if you're on the move, or you're in a region where you just don't stay somewhere long enough, or maybe you just don't have the technical know-how to really set anything up? And that is where the project that I'm actually working on comes in. It's called CallNet, and it is cool. It's an Arabic word that's sort of a root syllable in a bunch of different words that talk communication, to tell, to say, to utter. So there's a bunch of Arabic words that share this root syllable in it, and that's the name of the project. So this event in Egypt, 2011, that's kind of what inspired some people to start this project. So it was started in 2012, and it is fundamentally a communication tool. But it is a communication tool for your phone and for your laptop. Mostly phone, but also laptops. It's decentralized and it is ad hoc. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about what that means. There's a bunch of tech jargon flying around in the next few slides. I promise I will explain all of that. So if you look at some of the user features, it supports decentralized message flooding. It's essentially a highly decentralized Twitter. It actually also had the 140 character limit because some people thought that was funny. You can send direct messages to people, and you can have little groups of just 3 or 4 people. You can have file sharing, which works in the way that you announce a file and say, "Hi, this is a file. Anyone who wants it, come to me." And then you people download it from you. In theory, it does some network deduplication where if 10 people want it, it only sends it as often as is required. So it was a little bit inspired by torrenting. And also you can do voice calls. What you end up building is communities and networks that look like this. So everyone has a sort of device, and they just link to each other directly without any need for infrastructure in the middle. The special thing about this was that CallNet, the application, was self-replicating. So if you didn't have this application, you could join just this Wi-Fi network that was there, CallNet. What is that? That's an open Wi-Fi. You join it, and you're welcomed by a captive portal that said, "Hi, this is this thing. Here are download links for applications of your platform." And then you downloaded it, and then that client would slowly suck up all the other binaries from the network that it could find, so that you yourself could then seed new clients to other people. So the technologies involved were ad hoc Wi-Fi, the OLSR routing protocol I mentioned earlier, and we used zip for voice over IP, which was a huge mistake. So the kind of infrastructure and the networks that you started building looked like this. We actually had like a screen where you could visualize the network. I am really sad that there's like a screenshot of a really large community with like maybe 100 nodes, and it looked amazing, and I couldn't find it anymore in the preparation for this talk, so this had to do. But it looked pretty chaotic at the end. Like the more people just joined, you built. Sometimes you just built these little bubbles, and sometimes you just had these like hops one by one next to another bubble. This screenshot was from an art installation that was this. So I mentioned Pringles cans earlier. Basically, those with Wi-Fi antennas in the middle, some foil around it to make it waterproof, and some wood as a. I think the whole thing took like a couple of days to build. Now, Berlin geography. The building with the dome in the background is our parliament building. The thing on the left is the Brandenburg Gate, and the tiny, tiny bit of building that you can see at the corner is the US Embassy. So what people built was this thing across from the US Embassy with other towers around the US Embassy. And it was like this month-long art installation where people put up this Wi-Fi network where people just joined and talked about how bad the US surveillance state was. Apparently they weren't super happy about it, but it was on the building, like it was on the roof of the French and Swiss embassy, so like you couldn't really do anything. Generally, the fascinating thing about Callnet is that it is zero config, so you don't have to be a tech person to set it up. And so there were a lot of people, these were like two people from a university in Paris that did like some long-range testing in Taiwan, I want to say. There's a map in one slide where you can see a few use cases where it's being used. But like the reason, or the fact that it was zero config and like you just installed it, you opened it, it would get you through a setup dialog, and that was it, meant that a lot of people could engage with this without needing to understand routing tables and like kernel parameters and flashing firmware. I made it a lot more accessible, and it came out of the Freifunk project and just made it all more accessible. So this is a bit of a map. I think this is outdated at this point, but I think there should be a few more dots, but use cases generally of these applications have been in the Middle East, a lot in Europe. I know that around Paris there's a pretty active community about this stuff. In Brazil, I think there's people in Sao Paulo that like use this app to build their semi-permanent infrastructure because it's super easy to set up. And if you don't have any other internet hookup, or if you don't have any hookup to other infrastructure, you just make your own. The beautiful thing was that it is backwards compatible to Freifunk. So if you have this thing, and then you want to build like some long-range equipment as well, and like use these routers that you can just buy as well, then that's completely 100% compatible. When I wrote these slides, I was like, they'll feel like a butt coming. And there is a bit of a but coming. The project has existed since 2012, and it's not gotten as big as it could have been, and I think that's because of a few things, mostly because tech companies moved on. So I mentioned Wi-Fi ad hoc. Wi-Fi ad hoc is a Wi-Fi mode where multiple client devices agree on like a frequency hopping scheme with each other without a hotspot. And so if you have 5 devices, they all sort of agree on some frequency and the way that they hop between them, and channel and stuff, and then they make their own Wi-Fi together. The problem with that is that it's kind of power hungry, and it was never meant to be used the way that we're using it. It was meant for like setting up your Wi-Fi printer, or IoT, before IoT was really a thing. And so it was deprecated, and it was replaced with something else. What that means now is that on modern phones, you need a rooted phone. And like your phone needs to be quite old for you not to need a rooted phone. The other thing is that it's a 7-year-old C code base. It has a lot of spaghetti code in it, and it's basically unmaintainable. We tried to patch some features in over time, and we hit a wall in development, and so in the last 3 years, there have not really been any updates. Not that distributing updates would be easy because you would have to like build a bunch of binaries and distribute the source code to people who will then go to communities that are running this stuff. But it also meant like we kind of stopped being able to develop stuff. I heard this is a Rust conference, and some of you might be asking yourself the questions, have you thought rewriting it in Rust? And yes, we have. We had some plans. So what we wanted to really do is support modern hardware. What that means is a new standard called Wi-Fi Direct, which isn't as cool as Wi-Fi ad hoc. It's more power saving and is clearly more focused for you have a Wi-Fi printer or an IoT lamp and you would like to set that up. But I think we can still make it work in our favor. And also Bluetooth 5, 4 or 5 introduced the meshing, I can't remember. But the current Bluetooth standard has like meshing capabilities built in, so we can just piggyback off that. The next sentence is a bit like jargony, but I will explain all of it. We wanted to become delay tolerant, and we wanted to become more of a pocket switched network. So I'll explain what that means in a second. And also, we wanted to move away from being an app, because like it's an app and it's like cool, but we wanted to make it into a platform that people can build stuff with. So that was our grant proposal in 2018, and that was accepted in March of this year, and then I quit my job and I started doing that. So CallNet 2.0 is currently in the works. We decided to relicense from GPL3 to AGPL3 because we are becoming a platform to build stuff with, and the entire application and every technology that was sort of this all was built on came from a very radical free software movement, and so it was important to us to remain copyleft licensed in this way. Yeah, it's all written in Rust except for some small platform shims that need to be written in C++ for Android because the Android API is weird. It runs on modern Android and iOS. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention that. It only ran on iOS before when you jailbreaked your phone, which is really not cool. And also, we're still aiming for it to be backwards compatible with Freifunk, but because of the limitations that we don't have root access on phones, it means that you need to have one phone in between this network and a Freifunk network that is rooted that can be the bridge. But apart from that, it'll just be backwards compatible. So there's a few jargon terms I want to throw at you and then explain what they mean, because I think this is really cool, and this is something that I think we can only really do because we're rewriting this stuff in Rust, because it is such a difficult problem space to solve. If I was doing this in C, I don't think we could do it. The one thing is delay tolerance, the other thing is vector routing, and the third is about a service extension API. And first of all, I want to say bingo. So let's start with delay tolerance. What that means is that if Alice and Bob are having a chat, and Bob's phone runs out of power, what do? In a centralized service, it would be pretty clear. The messages are cached with the server, and when Bob comes back online, they get their messages. But we don't have any servers, and we don't want to have any servers. So instead, in our routing protocol, we built in delay tolerance. So what we do is we keep a journal of frames, a frame being like a packet. We keep a journal of like undelivered frames, and when through magic algorithms, we detect that someone isn't on the network anymore, we can put it in the journal, and then at some point test in the future when that person comes back online if we can deliver it. It's very oversimplified, but that's basically what it means. The result of this is that people can communicate with each other that are in two completely separate networks. So if you have two towns and they both have like these networks, and you have people going back and forth by foot, car, bike, whatever, they can be the data carriers between these two networks, and the people communicating with each other don't even have to know that they're literally living like miles apart, because sure, they might notice, hey, my messages have like a 2-day delay, but they're still getting delivered and I'm still getting replies. So they can guess, probably someone on a bike or someone in like a truck or something. But it still means that people can communicate with each other. The second big thing that we wanted to change is to move away from OLSR, because that also requires access to kernel tables, like kernel routing tables, and we don't have that on most devices. So the concept that we're implementing is called vector routing. In short, OLSR uses lots of graph theory, and it builds like a graph of the entire network, and then uses Dijkstra's graph traversal to find the optimal route between A and B. It does mean that if your graph is more than a few hundred nodes big, this kind of falls over, and especially because we wanted to support older phones, it just kind of ground to a halt, and people couldn't take part in it anymore. What vector routing means is that it turns into a gossip protocol. So when someone joins the network, they sort of put out an announcement, and then this announcement is spread through the network, and everyone sort of stores that announcement as a, hey, someone joined the network and I can talk to this person, and they only store the interface that it was received on, which means that if I want to send a message to someone, I don't have to care what the network looks like. I just have to know the person who told me about that person and give that message to them, and then the network will sort of figure itself out. That, by the way, is the underlying principle of how Batman works. So we're basically re-implementing Batman with a bunch of stuff in user space so that we don't need root. The third thing, the service extensions, we don't want to be an app. Also, we've had people talk to us, especially from Syria, because they wanted to use our app to spread information about sanitary installations and food situations and stuff. And so they wanted to build a wiki on top of our library. And we sat there and went, well, with the old app, you can't really do that. So instead, what we're doing is there's going to be libcall, which, it currently exists, but the API isn't finished yet. It's a Rust library. It has C bindings for all sorts of platforms, but it also has HTTP bindings, like a REST API. So if you just want to do some high-level scripting against this framework that allows you to write internet-independent applications, you can, just with a REST API. And the beautiful thing about this is that you can also interact with other applications that register themselves this way. You only have one daemon running in the background that does all the network stuff, and then all these applications just connect to this thing via a proxy on your phone. What this means, and if you look at this from a bit further back, is that we're trying to build a sneaker net versus an internet. The idea is that you can still have these pockets that you can link together via a Tor bridge or a VPN or something. They don't have to be always physically connected to each other, but you build these communities from the bottom up, and then these bottom up communities can grow together naturally instead of being connected by an entity at the top that allows everyone to communicate. Because this way, there's nothing to control. Sure, you can still take out the cell phone networks and stuff, but if you also provide your own infrastructure in certain regions, you are more redundant against that. And I think what we would be able to do is build a very different internet. One that is not controlled by single entities, and one that we generally have more control over. So what's next? We have a plan, and a plan being a plan means that it'll go perfectly with no issues whatsoever. We want to have an alpha on Android by the end of the year, so December, ready for the Chaos Congress in Germany. We want to have a sort of stable API for libcall in January, so that we have a few groups that want to work with our tech, so that they can start working on their stuff, and we're not going to change the entire API. We have funding that lasts for 16 more months. We have some avenues of maybe getting more funding, but that's our current scope. Also, we want to do a lot of field tests, which might have me go to Australia by train, which I'm looking forward to. If you want to help, if any of this sounds interesting to you, whether it be setting up ad hoc or more decentralized Wi-Fi infrastructure in your town, or if it's getting involved with this project, we have a website. We host our own GitLab, although we are mirrored on GitHub if you just want to star us for something, but development happens on our own server. We have an IRC channel for casual conversation, and we have a Zulip, which acts as a bit of a forum where people can ask questions. We have long form posts. We kind of use it as an RFC thing as well, where people can be like, hey, I thought about this thing, what do you think? And we have immediately threaded chat underneath. So if any of this sounds interesting, also I would love to talk to you more about any of this, and if you think this might be your kind of jam, get involved. I think there's some cool Rust things to do. I think we can build a better internet, and I think we should. It's not something that gets advocated for very often, especially at tech conferences. We all always consider the internet to be somewhat monolithic, and there's these central points where everyone interacts. And I think that's not a good idea. And I think we should all put some resources into even just thinking about how we can decentralize the world. Thank you.